Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We talk about all kinds of amazing ecosystems here, but there's one that I think gets overlooked a lot, and that's grasslands. They're often seen as just like, well, grass, right? But there's so much more to them. So today we're diving deep into grassland ecosystems. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click the bell icon so you don't miss out on future deep dives.
I think you're right. They are really overlooked. People might think they're simple or even boring compared to a rainforest, but when you really look closer, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
So whether you're studying for the UPSC exam, learning about ecology in school, or just curious about nature, this one's for you. We're going to be exploring a document called Grassland Ecosystems, Biodiversity, Conservation, and Economic Significance.
Sounds good.
We're going to uncover some really cool stuff, like the role of wildfires and grazing animals, and we'll even discover why India is like a hidden treasure trove of different grassland types.
I'm intrigued already.
Me too. Okay, so first things first, how do we actually define a grassland ecosystem? What makes it different from, say, a forest?
Well, think wide open spaces. Grasses are the dominant plants. You'll see few or no trees.
Okay, so it's all about the grass. But hold on, when we say grass, are we talking about any green plant out there?
That's a good question. Actually, grass refers to a specific family of plants called Poaceae. It's a huge family with all sorts of members like wheat and rice.
Oh, wow, I never thought of it like that. So those staple crops are actually grasses too.
That's right. And because this Poaceae family can thrive in all kinds of climates, grasslands are found pretty much everywhere. You find them on every continent except Antarctica.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yep.
So there are grasslands all over the world, but they can't all be the same, right?
Of course not. We can broadly classify grasslands into two main types: tropical grasslands, which are also called savannas, and temperate grasslands, often called steppes.
Okay, so if I'm picturing a savanna, I'm thinking like a classic African safari scene. Scattered trees, a watering hole, maybe some zebras or lions roaming around.
Yeah, you got it. Those are all hallmarks of a tropical grassland or savanna. Hot, dry climates with seasonal droughts and those scattered trees.
Okay, and what about temperate grasslands? What do they look like?
Well, think vast open plains, maybe a herd of bison grazing in the distance. Temperate grasslands or steppes usually have moderate temperatures, distinct seasons, and very few trees.
So they're pretty different from savannas then.
Definitely. But both types are incredibly important ecologically.
And the cool thing is that both savannas and steppes can be found right here in India.
Absolutely. India has a surprisingly diverse range of grasslands.
Okay, I'm ready for a virtual tour of India's grassland treasures. Where should we start?
Let's start with the Deccan Plateau. It's a classic example of a savanna right here in India.
So what would we see if we were there?
Picture rolling hills covered in a mix of short and tall grasses stretching out as far as you can see. It's home to some fascinating animals too, like the Indian wolf and the Indian fox.
Wow, it sounds amazing. Okay, what about the Western Ghats? I always think of them as those lush green mountains. Do they have grasslands too?
They do. High up in the Western Ghats, nestled among the Shola forests, you'll find the Shola grasslands.
So it's like a hidden world up there.
You could say that. These grasslands are at high altitude and have really unique plants and animals. You might even spot the endangered Nilgiri tar, a type of mountain goat.
Okay, I'm adding that to my list of places to see. So we've got savannas and these high-altitude grasslands. What other types does India have?
Well, we can't forget the Punjab Plains. They're part of the Indo-Gangetic Plain and are super important for agriculture.
Right, the breadbasket of India.
Exactly. It's where a lot of the country's wheat and rice are grown.
So they're not just ecologically important, but also vital for food security.
Absolutely. And to complete our tour, we have to mention the Eastern Himalayan grasslands.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. They sound pretty incredible.
They are. Imagine those snow-capped peaks in the distance, rhododendrons dotting the hillsides, and maybe even a glimpse of a red panda or snow leopard.
Wow, now that's a view I'd love to see. So from the Deccan Plateau to the Himalayas, India really does have an incredible variety of grasslands.
It really does.
It's amazing how these ecosystems that seem so simple on the surface can support so much life. And speaking of their resilience, how do they manage to thrive in such challenging conditions?
Well, a big part of it is adaptation. Let's start with the most obvious challenge: limited rainfall.
Right, we talked about how that prevents forests from taking over. But how do the grasses themselves deal with the lack of water?
They've become masters of water conservation. They have deep root systems that can tap into underground water sources, and their short stature helps minimize water loss.
Wow, so they're like experts at making the most of every drop.
Exactly.
But okay, this next one I don't quite get. Wildfires. You'd think fire would be destructive, but you're telling me it's actually beneficial for grasslands.
It might seem counterintuitive, but yes, wildfires are like a natural reset button for grasslands.
A reset button.
Yeah, think of it like a natural pruning process. Fire prevents trees from encroaching and taking over, which gives the grasses a chance to flourish. Plus, the fire clears out all the dead plant matter, and that releases nutrients back into the soil, which helps new growth.
Oh, so it's like a cycle of renewal. And I guess the animals that live in grasslands have adapted to fire too, right?
Exactly. Some animals will flee from a fire, but others have developed ways to survive it. For example, think of burrowing animals like prairie dogs. Their underground homes protect them from the heat and flames.
It's amazing how they've adapted to such a harsh environment. So we've got limited rainfall and fire shaping these landscapes. But there's another force at play, grazing animals.
That's right.
I can see how their grazing would keep the grasses trimmed, but what other effects do they have?
Well, they're not just lawnmowers. Their hooves churn up the soil, which aerates it and helps seeds disperse. And their dung acts as a natural fertilizer, enriching the soil.
So it's all connected. Now, you mentioned large herbivores earlier, like elephants. How do they fit into this picture?
Elephants are what we call ecosystem engineers. They can have a huge impact on grasslands.
How so?
Well, their browsing habits help keep trees in check. And because they're so big, they create trails and clearings as they move around, which lets sunlight reach the ground.
So they're shaping the landscape as they go.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how all these animals, both big and small, play a role in keeping grasslands healthy.
It really shows the interconnectedness of nature.
Okay, so we've taken a virtual tour of grasslands around the world and even explored the different types found in India. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to talk about why these ecosystems are so important to us humans.
You're absolutely right. They're often overlooked. But grasslands are incredibly valuable, both economically and ecologically.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the economic and ecological significance of these often underappreciated landscapes. Where should we start?
Well, let's begin with the most obvious benefit, agriculture. Think about it. Many of the world's staple food crops, like wheat, barley, and oats, are grown in grasslands. And of course, livestock rely heavily on grasslands for grazing.
Right, it's easy to forget where our food comes from, but grasslands play a huge role in feeding the world. And it's not just about what we eat directly, right?
No, it's much bigger than that. Grasslands support a vast network of trade, both within countries and internationally. Think about all the agricultural products that are traded globally. Grains, meat, dairy products, they all originate in grassland ecosystems.
Wow, so grasslands are literally feeding the global economy. But it's not just about economics, is it? What about their ecological importance?
Well, for one thing, grasslands are incredibly important for biodiversity conservation. They provide habitat for all sorts of plants and animals, many of which are found nowhere else on Earth.
So protecting grasslands means protecting these unique species. I always hear about forests and their role in absorbing carbon dioxide. But what about grasslands? Do they play a role in mitigating climate change?
Absolutely. Their extensive root systems store huge amounts of carbon underground, so they're really effective carbon sinks.
Wow, so even though they might not be as visually striking as a forest, they're still making a big difference in the fight against climate change.
Exactly.
And I'm guessing they play a big role in maintaining healthy soil too, right?
You got it. Those dense root systems we talked about help prevent soil erosion, which is super important for keeping land fertile for agriculture. And they're constantly adding organic matter to the soil, improving its fertility and water holding capacity.
It's like a natural system for sustainable agriculture. It's amazing how these seemingly simple ecosystems can contribute so much. And it's not just food, climate, and soil, right? Grasslands have potential for renewable energy too, don't they?
They do. Their wide open spaces are perfect for wind and solar energy projects.
And let's not forget their value for research. Scientists are constantly studying grasslands to learn more about everything from biodiversity to ecosystem dynamics.
That's right.
It's really incredible how much these often overlooked ecosystems contribute to our world. From food security to climate change mitigation to renewable energy, grasslands are true, multifaceted treasures.
They really are. And as we move forward, it's crucial that we recognize their value and work to conserve them.
Well said. We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've defined grasslands, explored their different types, taken a virtual tour of India's diverse grasslands, and even delved into their economic and ecological significance.
That's a lot to digest.
It is. But there's even more to come. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore the challenges facing grasslands and what's being done to protect them.
Sounds good. I'm ready to learn more. So we've seen just how diverse and valuable grasslands are.
Right? From the savannas of Africa to the steppes of Asia and all those amazing grasslands we have right here in India. But as with anything precious, grasslands are facing some serious challenges. What are some of the biggest threats to these vital ecosystems?
Well, one of the most pressing issues is habitat loss and fragmentation.
Habitat loss, I can see how that would be a problem.
As the human population grows, we need more land for things like agriculture and urban development. And unfortunately, grasslands are often converted to these other uses, which means less and less space for these ecosystems to thrive.
Yeah, it's like we're slowly but surely squeezing them out.
That's a good way to put it.
And this fragmentation, that must have a big impact on the animals that depend on these vast landscapes.
Absolutely. When grasslands are broken up into smaller, isolated patches, it makes it much harder for wildlife to move around. They can't migrate as easily, they have trouble finding mates, and even accessing the resources they need to survive.
It's like putting up all these roadblocks for them.
Exactly, and this can lead to a decline in biodiversity and in some cases even local extinctions.
It's a classic case of habitat loss leading to a loss of species.
Yeah.
But it's not just about physical space.
Right.
What other threats are there?
Another big one is overgrazing.
Overgrazing, how does that work?
Well, when you have too many livestock grazing in one area for too long, it can damage the vegetation. The animals eat too much of the grass and compact the soil, making it difficult for the grassland to recover.
So it's like using up the resources faster than they can replenish.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of other problems like soil erosion, which makes the grassland more vulnerable to things like invasive species and less productive overall.
So it's a downward spiral. Speaking of invasive species, how big of a problem are they for grasslands?
They can be a real nuisance. Imagine a new plant species comes in that can grow really fast, and it outcompetes all the native grasses. That's what we're dealing with when it comes to invasive species. They disrupt the balance of the ecosystem, they change the habitats, sometimes they introduce diseases, and ultimately they reduce the overall biodiversity of the grassland.
It's like they're taking over.
Pretty much.
So we've got habitat loss, overgrazing, invasive species. Are there any other threats we should be worried about?
Well, we can't forget about pollution.
Right. Pollution.
It comes from various sources: agricultural runoff, industrial activities, even car emissions. And it can contaminate the soil and water in grasslands, harming both plants and animals.
So it's like a whole cocktail of threats. And then, of course, there's the big one, climate change.
Definitely. Climate change is a huge concern for grasslands all over the world.
How so?
Well, rising temperatures are a problem, and then there are changes in rainfall patterns. We're seeing more extreme weather events like droughts and floods. All of these things are putting extra stress on these ecosystems.
It sounds pretty dire. But in the face of all these challenges, there must be some hope, right? What are people doing to protect and restore these vital ecosystems?
There's definitely hope. There are lots of dedicated people and organizations working hard to conserve grasslands.
That's good to hear. What are some of the things they're doing?
Well, one important approach is establishing protected areas, like national parks and wildlife sanctuaries.
So basically setting aside land where grasslands can thrive without the pressures of development or overgrazing.
Exactly. These protected areas act like safe havens for grassland ecosystems. And within these areas, we can implement careful management practices to ensure the long-term health of the grassland.
That makes sense. But what about grasslands outside of protected areas? How can we promote sustainable practices in those landscapes?
That's a great question, and it's a real challenge. It requires a multifaceted approach. One strategy is to encourage sustainable grazing practices. This means carefully managing the number of livestock in an area, rotating grazing areas so the grass has time to recover, and making sure the land isn't overgrazed.
So it's about finding that balance between using the land for economic benefit and allowing it to regenerate naturally.
Exactly.
And what about those pesky invasive species? Any solutions for those?
It's tricky, but there are ways to control them. Often it involves a combination of strategies. Sometimes we can physically remove them. In other cases, we might use targeted herbicides. And sometimes we can even introduce natural predators or competitors to keep them in check.
So it's like a constant battle.
You could say that.
Now, we've talked about protected areas, sustainable grazing, and invasive species control. But what about the role of research and education? How do they contribute to grassland conservation?
They're both absolutely crucial. Research helps us understand how these ecosystems work, how they respond to threats, and how we can best protect them.
So it's like using science to guide our actions.
Exactly. And education is vital for raising awareness about the importance of grasslands.
You need to get people excited about grasslands.
We do.
Okay, so we've got research, education, protected areas, sustainable grazing, invasive species control. Anything else?
Well, another important approach is restoring degraded grasslands.
So trying to bring back what's been lost.
Exactly.
How does that work?
Sometimes it involves planting native grasses, controlling erosion, or even reintroducing native wildlife.
So it's like giving these ecosystems a second chance.
You could say that. And speaking of giving back, local communities play a huge role in grassland conservation.
Oh, how so?
Well, they have a deep understanding of the land and are often the best stewards of these ecosystems. Their involvement is essential for the success of any conservation effort.
So it's about empowering local communities to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. And it's not just about their knowledge, it's also about creating economic opportunities that are tied to conservation.
Like what?
Well, sustainable tourism, for example, can provide economic benefits to communities while promoting grassland conservation.
So everyone wins.
Exactly.
Now, with all these efforts going on, are there any success stories? Are there places where grassland conservation is actually making a difference?
Absolutely. There are some really inspiring examples from around the world.
Like what?
Well, one example is the American Prairie Reserve in Montana. They're working to create a vast, intact prairie ecosystem by acquiring land, restoring degraded areas, and working with local communities.
Wow, so it's like rebuilding a lost world.
Pretty much. And closer to home, we have the Shola grasslands and the Western Ghats.
Right, those high-altitude grasslands we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Organizations like the Wildlife Conservation Society are working with local communities there to restore grasslands, control invasive species, and promote sustainable grazing.
It's great to hear that there are positive things happening.
Oh.
But even with these success stories, I imagine the challenges facing grasslands are still pretty significant.
They are. All the threats we've discussed, habitat loss, overgrazing, invasive species, pollution, and climate change, they're all interconnected. It's going to take a lot of effort to address them effectively.
So where do we go from here? What are the key things we need to do to make sure these vital ecosystems have a future?
Well, I think the most important thing is to change the way we view grasslands.
What do you mean?
We need to stop thinking of them as empty spaces and start recognizing them for the valuable assets they are. They provide essential services for both humans and wildlife, and their future depends on the choices we make.
So it's a call to action.
It is.
Okay, so we need to change our perspective, but what about concrete actions? What can we do to make a difference?
Well, we need strong policies and legislation to protect grasslands and promote sustainable land management practices. We need laws that regulate grazing, development, and pollution control in these ecosystems.
So it's about setting clear boundaries and creating incentives for people to do the right thing.
Exactly. And technology can play a big role, too.
Oh, how so?
Think about using drones to monitor grassland health, satellites to track invasive species, and sophisticated computer models to predict the impacts of climate change.
So it's about using the latest tools to help us protect these ancient landscapes.
Precisely. But technology is just one piece of the puzzle. We also need to keep investing in research and education.
Right, because the more we know about grasslands, the better equipped we'll be to protect them.
Exactly.
And the more people understand their value, the more likely they are to support conservation efforts.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored the threats facing grasslands, the strategies being used to conserve them, and the key things we need to do to ensure their future.
It's been a whirlwind tour.
It has, but there's still more to come. In our final part, we're going to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. We'll explore how grasslands are connected to other ecosystems and even human health.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about grasslands as these sort of standalone ecosystems. But in reality, they're part of a much bigger picture. Right?
Yeah.
We can't just think about them in isolation.
Right. They're connected to other ecosystems and to human health in so many ways.
It's all connected.
It really is.
So how do grasslands fit into this bigger interconnected web?
Well, think of it like this. Grasslands are often part of landscapes that include forests, wetlands, rivers, even urban areas. And all of these ecosystems are linked through the flow of water, nutrients, and the movement of wildlife.
It's like a giant network.
Exactly. So it's not enough to just protect isolated patches of grassland.
Right.
We need to manage entire landscapes in a way that supports all of these interconnected ecosystems.
And that includes humans, too, right?
Absolutely. Which brings us to the concept of One Health.
Okay, One Health. I've heard that term before, but I'm not really sure what it means.
It's a way of thinking about health that recognizes the interconnectedness of humans, animals, and the environment.
Interesting.
It's a holistic approach that seeks to find solutions that benefit all three.
So it's like we're all in this together.
Exactly. And grasslands play a really important role in this interconnected web of health. Well, for one thing, healthy grasslands can act as natural barriers that reduce contact between wildlife and livestock, which can help prevent the spread of diseases that can jump from animals to humans.
Oh, you mean like zoonotic diseases?
Exactly. So by protecting grasslands, we're not just conserving biodiversity.
We're also protecting ourselves.
Exactly.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. So protecting grasslands can have direct benefits for human health.
It can. And it goes beyond just disease prevention.
Okay, how?
Well, healthy grasslands provide us with clean air and clean water. They help maintain fertile soil. All of these things are essential for human health and well-being.
It's incredible how much we rely on these ecosystems.
It really is.
Now, we've talked about the ecological and human health connections, but I imagine there are also cultural and spiritual connections to grasslands, right?
There are. For many indigenous cultures around the world, grasslands are sacred spaces. They're woven into their traditions, stories, and way of life.
So it's not just about the material benefits we get from these landscapes.
Right.
It's also about cultural identity and spiritual connection.
Exactly. And recognizing these cultural values is crucial for effective grassland conservation.
So we've explored all these different connections: ecological, human health, cultural. It really highlights how important it is to see grasslands as part of a much larger whole.
It does.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that grasslands are not empty spaces. They're vibrant ecosystems that are essential for both humans and wildlife. They're connected to everything around them, and their future depends on us.
That's a powerful message. It's a call to action. So what can we do? How can we make sure that these amazing landscapes have a future?
Well, we can start by learning more about them. The more we understand about grasslands and the challenges they face, the better equipped we'll be to advocate for their protection.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
Yeah.
And we can make conscious choices in our everyday lives. We can support sustainable agriculture by choosing products from farms that practice responsible grazing and land management. We can reduce our own carbon footprint. We can get involved in conservation efforts.
So it's about taking action, big or small.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
And using our voices to speak up for these often overlooked ecosystems.
Absolutely. Let's make sure grasslands are part of the conversation.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I know I've learned a lot.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners have too. We've explored the fascinating world of grasslands, from their ecology to their connections with other ecosystems and human well-being. And we've talked about the challenges they face and what we can do to help protect them. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep speaking up for the amazing world of grasslands. And don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into the wonders of the natural world. Until next time, stay curious.